Hello, class, and welcome to one last final lecture today on the Minor Prophets. It's been quite the journey, hasn't it, with this online schooling? There have been many challenges, but we've been doing things differently, and I do want to say that I'm really proud of the work that you guys have put in as 7th graders. I've seen fairly consistent work from you guys. I've seen that you are understanding it, and really, it's difficult with the Bible, especially with some of these minor prophets and books that are fresh and new, to learn how to then not just understand what you're reading, but then to apply these teachings that are really, really old too, right? And so sometimes it's difficult and challenging to make it relevant to our modern 21st century American Christian context, right? But I do think that a lot of these books have so much to teach us. Today we're going to be getting into 3 of the last minor prophets. Now we're not actually covering every single one of the 12 minor prophets in detail, but we're going to cover most of them. Today we're going to talk about Haggai, Zechariah, and then the final book of the Old Testament, Malachi. All right. So Haggai, it's a pretty short book. Haggai and Zechariah both go hand in hand, actually. They were prophets during the same time. I've mentioned before that oftentimes, especially during times of crisis and turmoil and all kinds of things going on within the kingdom of Israel or Judah, that God sends multiple prophets. It's kind of like, listen, you need to hear more than just one voice. You need, and prophets aren't omnipresent. They can't be literally everywhere all the time, right? And so sometimes they're sent here or here or here or here, right? Haggai is a prophet during the time of the exile, as many of the prophets we've talked about so far, during the time of Darius the Great. Okay, so under Darius, originally under Cyrus the Great, right? Cyrus allowed the people to go back to Judah. Under Darius, he also allowed this Persian emperor allowed the people to rebuild the temple. All right, so things were going well at first, right? And then it kind of sat there. So they began the construction of the temple itself, but then it sort of sat for about 18 years. And so Haggai comes along, God speaks through Haggai, and basically is there to tell the people, to remind them of their priorities. Now here's the real problem. It's not just that they simply ran out of material or ran out of resources or time. What happened was they began to prioritize their time differently. Okay, so what was happening was they stopped the building of the destruction. They stopped the building reconstruction of the temple, and in place of that, they took their time to rebuild. The wealthy people, particularly, rebuild their own homes, and then even secondary homes, almost think of vacation homes. That's what they were doing. So it wasn't just a sense of they were neglecting the needs to build the temple. They were also neglecting the needs of the people and hospitality. One of the big commandments and big concerns of God, and we see this in the heart of Jesus, is reaching out to those who are who Jesus would call the least of these, right? People that are poor, people that are destitute, people who have no voice, right? There are people in our society today, right, that are just like that, who have no power, no voice, no say, but yet need to be heard, a God who hears them and responds to them. And so, but God wants to work through us. And so God's saying and reminding Israel through Haggai that it's you are called to a high standard of loving your neighbor. And whenever you're shifting your priorities away from God into yourself, it immediately goes to neglecting the needs of the people like the poor and those who have no voice. And God is going to be deeply concerned about that. And God's going to have some harsh words to say through Haggai to really judge the people through that. All right, so as we talked about, Haggai and Zechariah have some very similar things in common, where Haggai's words are really kind of towards Zerubbabel. I don't know if you remember that guy. He was one of the first to come back with exiles from Babylon to Israel. Zerubbabel, and then Joshua, which was the high priest at the time. Okay, different Joshua from the book of Joshua, much later. Okay, so his words were mainly towards those leaders, right? Haggai's words were towards those leaders. Zechariah, on the other hand, he's not going to reference them as much. Okay? Zechariah is really going to focus, and it's a longer book. So his oracles, his statements are really going to focus on repentance, that the people need to remind them of the sin of the past too, right? That the reason they were in exile was because of this, right? Because of their rebellion against God, because of their idol worship, because of all those other things that went into play that prophets like Jeremiah and Isaiah and others had warned them about, saying, you will go into exile if this happens. Now, the other thing that's unique about Zechariah, and the reason why it's a much longer book for a minor prophet, is it includes apocalyptic language, okay? Which most Bible readers kind of associate apocalyptic language with the book of Revelation, which is the final book in the New Testament. But in fact, it's all throughout the Old Testament as well. And so some of these apocalyptic visions that Zechariah receives from God are going to be sort of repeated in the final book of Revelation. And Zechariah is going to point to a time of a Messiah, okay? Like many prophets in the Old Testament have talked about. But Zechariah is on board with that. So that's one of the differences between Zechariah and Haggai. Even though they're kind of saying some similar things, Zechariah is really going to focus on the coming Messiah, okay? And prophecies of that. He says, in the Messianic age, the time that the Messiah will come and dwell on this earth, everyone and everything will be sacred unto God, and all nations will worship the Lord as King. So he's saying, okay, not just Israel, not just Judah, every nation, Babylon, Syria, right? All these places, they will all bow down to this God. And so that the time of the Messiah is going to be for the whole world, right? As John 3:16 says, right? For God so loved the world. And that's kind of what Zechariah alludes to. All right, now let's transition into the final book of the Old Testament, and we'll wrap it up here. Malachi. Malachi is the final book that we have in the writings of the prophets, and it does serve as an appropriate conclusion to this book, and kind of a nice segue into the New Testament. And so the name Malachi means my messenger. It's not a typical Hebrew name. You don't see too many Malachis. We think Malachi probably had his ministry during the time of Ezra. So again, during that reconstruction period, remember Ezra, like in the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, right? Ezra. So again, a prophet probably during the time of other prophets showing up to the scene. The book suggests that the community was faced with issues of poor spiritual leadership, which Ezra in some ways was like that. That we had all kinds of weird marriage and divorce practices. If you remember, Ezra, as the priest at the time, was demanding the people to divorce their pagan, Babylonian wives and sending them back home with their Babylonian children. And it was this weird, moral dilemma. There's also injustice happening. People aren't tithing. So when people aren't tithing, those needs of the poor and so on are being neglected too, like we talked about with Haggai. And they're not serving God either. So there's a lot of things that Malachi really has to kind of push forward. And what's interesting here, and why it's a good segue between the Old Testament and the New Testament for Christians, is that this is exactly what Jesus' concerns are going to be about too. Many of the same concerns that God speaks through Malachi are going to be what Jesus does too. Neglecting the needs of the poor, and kind of just going through the rituals and going through the motions of just religion, and not really making the connection of what it means to love God and love our neighbor. That's the purpose of the covenant, right? That's the purpose of God's commandments and so on. Not just to go through sort of a ritual and pattern and habits and just blindly kind of going through your faith and not really thinking about the actual consequences and not really thinking about the impact that you should be making. Okay, so that's Malachi. And he kind of has this hopelessness. He's just kind of he starts off the books thinking, God, really? It seems like all is lost. It seems like there have been so many prophets. I'm just one in the line of so many. And the people just don't want to listen. The problem is that their hearts aren't in the right place. The problem is that their hearts are so hard and callous that it seems like nothing is going to get through to them. And he's partly right, because think about it. When Jesus shows up, right, there are so many, the large majority of them reject Jesus as the Messiah. Their hearts aren't ready for it. And I think this is still true today, right? You share God's love with somebody, and there's this sort of like, I don't want anything to do with it, because their hearts aren't in the right place. But Malachi knows, and I think a good lesson for us, is that we personally can't change someone's heart. It is only God who can do that. And so Malachi puts his trust and faith in God to say, okay, God, you do what you do best, and change people and transform them back into the likeness that they were meant to be. And that's the hope that Malachi has. So there's a future day of justice where all people will actually be where God desires them to be. This day would not come unannounced. And so when Malachi talks about this future time, we see these glimpses of the Messiah. We see the stories of the Nativity where the angel Gabriel shows up to Mary and says to her, you will have a son, and you will name him Emmanuel, because God is with us. And that's sort of the future hope here. And this is why it's such a great conclusion to the Old Testament and a great segue into all that we're going to talk about next year in the New Testament. All right, folks, that's going to do it for the Minor Prophets. And until next year.